Today we're going to be looking at two special tools that can help us when we're creating a mesh or modifying a mesh. One is called Edit Poly, which is a modifier in our modifier stack, and the other one is called Editable Poly, which we actually have to create an object and convert to an editable poly in order to be able to use it. So let's go ahead and start with that. The first thing I'm going to do is create a box. I'm not really worried about the size or the dimensions or whatever because we just want to show the tools in Edit and Editable Poly. So I've got a box here. The first thing, let's go over the modifier. Once I'm creating something and I want to change it or modify it, I'll go to the modifier stack. I'm going to use my drop down and then choose Edit Poly. Now if you're familiar with Editable Poly, a lot of the same tools are used. But what Edit Poly does that Editable Poly doesn't let us do, since it's in the modifier stack, is that we can then go back down to our box if we wanted to and change dimensions and parameters, and then go back into our Edit Poly, where if we convert an object to an editable poly, we can't easily go back to when it was just a shape. Okay, so I'm going to click on my Edit Poly so that I know it's active. If it's blue, I know it's active. And then from here, I can choose all kinds of ways of selecting parts of my mesh. So I can choose Vertex, which will allow me to choose one or more vertices that I can move and rotate and all kinds of things for. My edge does the same thing, polygons. These are just different ways that I can select objects. So anytime I want to select something, I can use one of these 5. And then depending on which one I choose, I'll have tools under the Edit Geometry that I can use to, well, edit my geometry. So first what I'm going to do is maybe play around with the polygon selection. And here I have this top polygon selection, and I have all of these tools that I can play around with. And what I would suggest is that, for example, if we wanted to extrude our polygon, instead of clicking on Extrude, which will use the default parameters that 3ds Max has, or the last ones that we use, what I would suggest is to get into the practice of choosing the little selection box or the settings box next to what we're trying to do. So if I'm trying to extrude, instead of clicking on Extrude, I want to click on the box just to the right. Because what this allows us to do is to always change our parameters to whatever we want to do. So let's say I want to extrude mine by 5. Then Extrude allows me to copy that poly and extrude it along either a positive path or a negative path. So if I say right now I'm at +5, if I go down to -5, then we see that I'm extruding inside. Okay, and then we have an X if we want to cancel, and we can see what happens just down here when we hover over a button, cancel, or we have apply and continue. What apply and continue does is it will apply the modifier that I'm doing, and then it will stay within that modifier and will automatically try to do the same thing that we just got through doing. So if I click apply and continue, it's going to try to extrude it again, -5, because that's what I had last time. I'm going to back out of that. And then we have OK, which is basically saying I set all the parameters that I want, but I only want to do it once. So OK, do that thing. And that's what it will do. And all I'm doing here is just Control Z to undo what I was doing. We have the same button here, undo. Then from Extrude, let's go to Bevel. Bevel can do kind of the same thing that Extrude does, except it adds a little feature in there. So I can still extrude just like Extrude did, but I can bevel at the same time. And it makes sense as it's called bevel. So for example, if I wanted to create something, maybe this is going to be like a chimney or whatnot, then I can say, this time I want to extrude it again. So I'm going to say apply and continue, and then here I can say maybe my bevel is 0 and I want to extrude higher. So let's click on that. Let's say OK. And then maybe here on this polygon I want to bevel. Maybe I don't want to extrude at all, but I want to bevel inwards. Maybe I'm going to use this for a material. Maybe I want a mirror material or something. So Editable or Edit Poly is really powerful because I can use these tools to change my shape relatively quickly. Now we've looked at some of the tools when we're in Polygon. Maybe let's look at some when we're in Edge or Vertex. Let's go to Vertex. Vertex has some really neat tools when we're in a Vertex selection mode. One thing that I like personally is the Weld and Target Weld. So let's say maybe I changed my mind here and I don't want this geometry here. And so I could come in my polygon and delete this. So it didn't change the polygons there. I still have these polygons that I need to try to do something with. But with Vertex, what it allows me to do is I can do either a weld or a target weld. So let's say I have 2 vertices selected, and all I did was I clicked on one, held down Control, and clicked on another. We can see that we have that plus sign. If I click Alt, then we can see we have the minus sign, which would take away part of a selection. But I'm going to add this vertex here. I have 2. And weld, what it allows me to do is to weld 2 vertices together. Now, it's important to understand that it won't weld any 2 vertices. So if I select a vertex over here and a vertex over here, if I click on weld, there's not really anything I can do, no matter how high I go, to connect those vertices, because there's no joining geometry. There's no geometry that is close to each vertex that's joined together. Like here we have geometry, here we have geometry, here we have geometry, but it's not close. Now if I were to select this vertex and this vertex here, they're pretty far away. I can still weld those together because they're joining. All I got to do is get my threshold up high enough that they'll weld together. If I don't want to weld 2 together, so for example, let's say I had these 2 vertices here selected and I want to weld them. But what I don't want to happen is to have the geometry change. If we look, we can see how they kind of pop in the middle of where the 2 are. And if I don't want that geometry to change, then instead of using weld, I can use target weld. And what target weld does is I can select a vertex that I want to weld. And when I click and let go, now I have this dotted line. And what will happen is if I can weld that vertex to another vertex, it will turn into a plus sign. And what it will do is it will move the vertex that I'm trying to weld to the one that I just welded. So let's take a look. I selected here, and let's select this one here, and it moved over to this one. So my geometry that makes up this chimney stays the same. It doesn't move. So I can do all of this here, and then that geometry that I made before is no longer there. We're back where we were before we did our bevel. Another neat tool when we're trying to add geometry is Connect. What Connect does is it takes 2 objects that we select, 2 or more objects, and it creates geometry that connects them. So here I have 2 vertical lines, and if I click Connect, I get this little Connect Edges parameter, these parameters here that I can change. By default, we have 1 line that's connecting both of these. If I want to add to that, I can. And then I can choose to pinch them so they can either get closer together or further apart. And then also if I want them to slide themselves. So if I want it to be higher or lower, this is a great way to create geometry relatively easily. Okay, so let's see how we can use some of these tools together. So I'm going to select these two lines, and I'm just making this up as I go along. I don't have any purpose in mind. And I'm going to connect them. And let's say I want 3. And let's say I want them a little bit further apart. Let's make that 4. So I have something specific in mind. Okay, that sounds good. Now I'm going to go to polygons, and select these 2 polygons, and I'm going to bevel them. That might be a little bit too much. So let's, bevel them, and then I'm going to extrude those. And then maybe here, let's throw in something we haven't used before. Let's select these lines, these on the top, and I'm going to chamfer, and we'll see what chamfer does. If I want to add to that, it makes it more rounded the more I go. Okay, so let's do that. Let's go back to our polygon, and maybe I want to take these 2 top polygons and extrude them negative. So maybe I have the top of my chimney now, but I need a place for a fire. So let's maybe bevel. Okay. Then I'm going to click OK and extrude, but I want to extrude. Oh, that looks good. Okay. I like it. So now we've got a little fireplace. Now the cool thing about Edit Poly and Editable Poly is that they have a lot of the same tools. So if I come in and right click and convert to Editable Poly, now I'm in Editable Poly, and we can see where before I had Edit Poly and Box. My box is gone, which means I can't go back down to the stack and change everything as far as the polygons on my base shape goes. Now I have to play around with this, but you can see that we have a lot of the same tools. So if I go to my polygon, we can see we have the same tools that we had there. Same with edge and vertex. And so this is a really powerful way to edit geometry. Now let's take a look at some little things that are a little bit more advanced than just basics. So I'm going to keep my Edit Poly active, and I'm going to look at my subdivision surface, and I'm going to use NURMS subdivision. Now what we'll see as soon as I click this on, this is going to start looking a lot smoother. So now we can see it looks more rounded, and the more iterations that I do, the more rounded it will look. But understand that when we do this, we're multiplying our geometry. See, we see my computer's chugging a little bit. It's had to think for quite a bit, because if we turn off our isoline view, we can see how much geometry we've created. So let's turn the iterations maybe down to something that we can see a little bit better. Maybe 3. Okay, this works a lot like Turbo Smooth or Mesh Smooth. And we do have some things that we can do with this. So let's say, for example, I'm going to go to my edge, and this is the box that I had before, the chimney that I had before. So I'm going to select an edge, and we can see the corresponding edge here in red. And if I do under edge properties, if I change the weight or the crease, let's see what happens when we crease. Then our edges get a lot sharper, or they're creased. So I'm just going to play around with some of these to show you what they do. Okay. So I'm going to select all 4 of these. And if one of them isn't, if they aren't the same, then this will be blank. And maybe I'll do these as well. And we can see how it's blank because the ones we just added were 0. And if I don't like what's going on, if I want to change it, then I can always turn my use NURM subdivision off, and then we'll go back to how it was originally. So maybe I want all of this to have a crease of 1. And I want this up here to have a crease of 1, except for my pipes. These 2 exhaust pipes. That's what I'm going to call them anyway. Then I can choose those, turn my crease to 0, and now they're more rounded. So this is a way to smooth our geometry, but also understand that it really takes our poly count upward. So I'm going to click on my statistics, which keyboard shortcut is 7, and we can see that, let's see, use, okay. So if let's copy this so I can show you what I mean. Okay, now if I convert this into an editable poly again, we can see that my polygons are significantly higher. When we're just using the NURM subdivision, it doesn't necessarily increase the poly count, but it does the same thing as if we create a turbo smooth. Turbo smooth. So it does the same thing as if we create a turbo smooth, and if we turn our iterations up, we can see that we're creating more geometry. So this is a quick little video about Edit Poly and Editable Poly and how we can use them to edit our geometry. So play around with those. In another video, we're going to talk about creating a mesh, like a character mesh, like we're going to animate, and we will be using Editable Poly. So get comfortable and get familiar with those tools so that if you want to participate in that video as well, then you'll be a lot more familiar with what we're going to do. Until then,